So today's session, as all of you who joined us are aware, we are talking about public wealth, and we're talking about how this public wealth can be used. And we have an interesting panel of two speakers. Both of them come from interesting backgrounds in terms of both entrepreneurship and working on the ground, grassroots. Our objective is to address the theme, which is India's public wealth in service of the public. And there are some key questions which kind of arise when we, basically think about public wealth. What is it? What is public wealth, and who controls it? And how can it then be monetized, or is it really monetized? And who is responsible for monetizing it? And then, most importantly, whoever is responsible for monetizing it has also a huge control over how they distribute it and who do they distribute it. Now, these are fundamental questions and which needs to be answered. These questions are seldom raised, but both our panelists are not only addressing these questions, they're also suggesting very practical and real implementable solutions for it. And these solutions are basically uh, geared around two diverse areas. One is in the area of minerals and mining, and the other is in the area of land. uh, I'll just lay down a couple of ground rules for the discussion, the guidelines for the discussion. One of them is that both the speakers, Rahul Basu and Rajesh Jain, uh, will get 15 minutes each. After which we will open up the Q&A. You can submit the Q&A, while they're speaking, but we will take the Q&A after both the speakers have finished speaking. The Q&A, as Asta pointed out earlier, can be submitted in the chat. I will select the questions and then I will ask if you have requested for a particular panelist to answer that question, then I will ask that particular panelist, or the question will be open to both the panelists. So that said, now I would like to invite Rajesh Jain for starting his basic plan on how to share public wealth with the in service of the public. Rajesh, the floor is all yours.
Hi everyone, great to be with you. I'll be speaking on Mission 10-20-30, the Nai Disha for Prosperity. You can find a lot of my ideas at rajeshjain.com. My email is rajesh@naidisha.com. So about me, I'm a tech entrepreneur. I did India's first internet portals 1995 to 2000. I've been running Netcode, which is Asia's largest digital marketing company for the last 22 years. In between, I also dabbled on the political and prosperity side as an entrepreneur. I set up Neeti Digital between 2011 and 14 to work on Narendra Modi's campaign. I did it from the outside. I funded it on my own. And then between 2015 and 2019, I set up an entity, Free a Billion, and followed that up with Nai Disha to create a movement for prosperity. While those ideas did not really pan out, a lot of what I'm going to speak about today builds on the thinking that emerged from those 3-4 years that I was working around freedom and prosperity. What we are seeing today, what we are living through, is the Third World War. It started by the pandemic, but it's going to be taken forward by the governments and the actions that governments do globally. What we have seen is that while the virus has its own impact, the economic devastation that is likely to come, in part with the virus, but also in a large part by government action, is going to create major economic crises globally. It's not going to end quickly. It's going to go on for a few years. I think we've got to see that. It's the devastation that you see during and after a world war. We are seeing the impact already in India. Falling incomes, rising job losses, enterprises starting to fail, and more likely to happen in the coming months and perhaps 1 to 2 years. And we have all seen the crisis of the migrants. Migrants have become the new refugees. We are facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions. And this quote from Milton Friedman captures the essence. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And that is the objective of sessions like these, to get the ideas out there. So when the crisis is there, the ideas can turn into action. At this juncture, India will face two futures. One is where we will try and depend on government for everything, or we could choose our own destiny. That's the choice that we will have to make as a nation. It is India's Mao or Deng moment, Deng Xiaoping. We can either go down further on the road to serfdom, what I call perpetually planned poverty, or we could take the path to prosperity. That would mean changing rules, not just rulers. In India, we have bestowed too much faith on rulers, and that's not going to help us going forward. Unless we change the rules, unless we reform in a very big way, we are not going to go down the path of prosperity. And this crisis, this third world war, would take India much further behind. Countries which have become prosperous have followed some or all of these prosperity principles. They have limited government. They practice non-discrimination. Everyone is equal in the face of law and rules that are made. There is economic freedom. There is decentralization down to the states and cities. Property rights are respected. There are free markets. There is a rule of law, and they practice free trade. This has been the secret of the success of many of the countries that have today become prosperous: the US, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, and so on, Hong Kong. But in India, what we have seen running for the last 70 plus years is an anti-prosperity machine. We see big government, not limited government, discrimination all the time, command and control instead of economic freedom, centralization, not decentralization. Property rights are limited. We see price interventions instead of letting markets function. We see delayed justice. And there's increasing rise in protectionism going forward. And that's the reason why India has lagged behind in prosperity. If you look at this chart, still about the 70s, all of these four countries in Asia were pretty much the same. And then you see the separation between them. Singapore raced ahead, South Korea much further ahead of China and India right at the bottom. That's the shift that we have to make. We have to embark on the path to prosperity. Choose the principles of prosperity centered around freedom. In 1947, we got political freedom. But what we ended up with was actually British Raj 2.0. The skin color of the rulers changed. The economic principles, the economic policies barely moved. The nature of government stayed big instead of giving more freedom to the people. We didn't get economic freedom. So if we have to think forward, I think these words by Daniel Burnham will serve us well. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. Make big plans and aim high in hope and work. And that is exactly what we will do going forward. What I'm proposing is Mission 10-20-30. how can we get 10 crore new jobs in the next 20 months till the end of 2021? And these are good jobs with a monthly income of 30,000 rupees plus. It's the one big idea to make Indians free and rich. So how do we make that happen? The starting point for this has to be a central focus around jobs. We'll also talk of where the money will come from and what is the plumbing that we need to make all of it happen. The jobs idea falls into two categories. The first one starts with returning 1 trillion wealth back to the people. And I'll talk about where this wealth is in a minute. We have all heard of universal basic income. What I'm proposing is something different. Universal wealth return, what I call Dhan Vapasi. It's returning to every Indian family their rightful share of 1 lakh rupees each year for the next 3 years from the public wealth of this country. This will put money in people's hands. We have a demand shock at this point of time in India. We need incomes of many have gone to zero in many cases. We need to put money in people's hands. When they spend the money, they will create, the consumption will get going, jobs will get created, factories will start running, and so on. That cycle needs to start with money in people's hands. The second big category of job creation is a massive spend in infrastructure and special economic zones with $1 trillion investment. We need to build roads, the hard infrastructure, roads, high-speed rail, airports, ports, and we need the soft infrastructure, strengthen the police force, our judiciary, and so on. We need special economic zones where new rules can be applied. So we do away with the past, start with a clean slate, much like China had done. And we can then hope to be part of global supply chains and replace 10 crore Chinese workers with Indian workers in the next 20 months. So the big question, of course, is where will the money come from? I think we should borrow $2 trillion from global funds. This is money sitting in earning negative interest rates worldwide. India can become one of the few beacons of hope for global investors. We will not get this money from India. We cannot afford to print money. We will burden future generations. Today's fiscal deficit is tomorrow's taxes. We cannot afford to increase taxes on an already beleaguered economy. What we need to do is to monetize surplus public assets. The surplus public wealth of India is locked up in minerals, land, and PSUs. There's $20 trillion locked up, 1,500 lakh crores. That's 15 followed by 14 zeros. This comes to 50 lakh rupees as the share of every Indian family. I'll give you one example. Take Lutyens, Delhi, where we have palaces, massive houses for our politicians and bureaucrats built during British times. These should have been done away with when we got independence, but the new rulers just moved into the same places. For 1,000 rulers, they are using up wealth worth 5 lakh crores, 20,000 rupees for every Indian family. What we need is the Prime Minister's Lutyens Delhi Liquidation Relief Yojana, among all the new yojanas which are likely to come. We then need to get the plumbing in place. We need to free India's entrepreneurs. Private enterprise is the only way forward for wealth creation. And for that, we need to have real reforms in India, real structural reforms, land, labor, administrative reforms, education reforms, police reforms. All of these reports have been created over the last 10, 15 years. Not much action has been done. That's what we need to get done. We need to ensure justice, 3-2-1 justice. Pendency to be clear in 3 years, 2 years to ensure that any new case can get a result, and 1 year for appeal. Only when there is justice will businesses have the confidence to invest. We need taxes cut to sub 10%, so more money can be kept with corporates and individuals for investing. We need our cities to be freed, Swatantra cities. Cities to be freed from the clutches of the central government and the state government. We need empowered mayors who have the financial autonomy to run their cities, because cities are where the wealth is going to get created. 40 crore Indians are going to move to cities in the next 15 to 20 years. And we need titling of every property in the country. Hernando de Soto has spoken about this idea in the past. What we need is this Nai Disha, which takes us on the path of freedom and therefore prosperity. This is Mission 10 2030. 10 crore new jobs, 20 months, 30,000 rupees for income for every job, for every person. This is Sampurna Swatantrata, the unfinished business of 1947, where we now get economic freedom for our people. Tolkien wrote in his famous Lord of the Rings, even the smallest person can change the course of the future. To this Mission 10 2030, we need to add 60 crore, the people of India. 30 crore Indian voters are fixed in whom they are going to vote for. They will not change their minds. They are fixed on their political support for one of the existing parties. But there are 30 crore non-voters who did not go out to vote. There are 30 crore non-aligned voters who make up their mind a few days before elections. India's politics is also going to get disrupted. We are not going to see politicians do rallies and face-to-face interactions or handshaking anymore because of the impact of the virus. This is a time to level the playing field with a disruptive innovation through digital politics. Pressure from these 60 crore people who demand prosperity can completely change the future of India. And this is the choice that we face. This is the path to the Indian revolution that is so needed to put our country on an irreversible path to prosperity.
Yeah, Rajesh, your time is over.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Point was, if it's not us, who? If not now, when? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajesh. That was a brilliant exposition and a great solution, which is practically implementable on the ground. And it's also mnemonically very powerful. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, 30. I think it will resonate with the general public, especially when you talk about redistribution of wealth. And there will be a lot of questions on it in the Q&A session, and we'll come to that. Now we have Rahul Basu with us. Rahul, you also have 15 minutes. And please go ahead, introduce yourself and go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Am I audible? I think I'm off mute. Eh?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah. Thanks, Yatish. I'd like to start by thanking the Nudge Foundation, Center for Civil Society, Luis Miranda, and you, Yatish, for giving us the opportunity to present our ideas. Sorry, I'm sharing the Zoom screen. Just give me a second. Yeah, so Goa Foundation is an NGO, it's an environmental NGO in Goa, which was started in 1986. And it's been working on the issues of environment issues caused by mining since 1992. Now, I actually come from a different background. I have a bachelor's degree in economics and MBA from Ahmedabad. And then I spent 18 years in Bombay in the finance world. And in 2008, I effectively retired and moved to Goa, hoping to be a consultant to startups. And when I spent some time understanding Goa, I realized that one of the biggest issues in Goa was that the overall governance issues. And I traced that back to the way mining was happening. And from 2011, I've been volunteering with Goa Foundation, specifically on the mining issue. And this work really comes out of the work of Goa Foundation on mining. In 2013, we were in the Supreme Court on Goa mining, and this started there. The Supreme Court asked us a stark question: how do we implement intergenerational equity? Intergenerational equity, I'm sure most of you are scratching your heads. We were at that time. We had no idea, so we tried to look around the world and see, what is best practice, what do others do. It turned out that intergenerational equity is a really simple idea. At its core, it says that whatever we, the current generation, inherit, we need to make sure our children and future generations also inherit. So let me give you a simple example. Suppose you inherit some gold jewelry from your parents. Now, across most of India, it's understood that we can sort of wear the jewelry and use it, but we have an obligation to make sure our children or our nephews and nieces inherit the jewelry. But the gold jewelry is a little bit of a headache. It can be stolen, so your choices are to dig a hole in the ground or put it into a bank locker, which then becomes an expense. So you decide, let me sell the jewelry, take the money, buy a piece of land. As long as I keep the land properly, I can enjoy the crop or the income, and future generations will inherit the land and they can enjoy the crop and income. So this is intergenerational equity. Now it turns out under the Constitution of India, minerals under subsoil minerals by and large are owned by the state governments as a trustee on behalf of the people and especially future generations. So the Goa government is responsible for implementing intergenerational equity with minerals. So will future generations of Goa inherit the minerals that we did? Let's look at a little case study on this. We looked at 8 years of mining. We took the data from SESA Goa, today's Vedanta, SESA Goa's annual reports, and the thought experiment was whatever they sold the mineral for, we as Goans, as owners of the minerals, could have sold it for the same value and asked SESA Goa to be a contractor. They would rightly have charged us all their expenses, plus they would want a profit. They're in business. So we applied a 20% after-tax return on capital employed. This is an extremely generous return, but we didn't want to have an argument that we were anti-capitalist or something. Now the total exported in those, we took the SESA Goa numbers and then used the volume numbers from the industry body to arrive at the total Goa numbers. So over the 8 years, we exported 88,000 crores. The total expense, including the reasonable profit, was 36,000 crores. So the value of the mineral that got exported from our perspective, as in the Goan perspective, we exported 51,000 crores or 52,000 crores of ore. So two questions. First is, how much should the Goa government have received? Well, the logical answer is they should have received 100%. If the Goan government is the owner and the value of the ore is 100, they should have got 100. The second question, this is our country. This is our legal system. These are audited financials. How much do you think the Goa government actually received for 52,000 crores of minerals? We looked at the Goa government budget statements, and this is what it told us. The Goa government got less than 5% of the value of its minerals. The people of Goa, and especially the future generations of Goa, lost 49,000 crores over these 8 years. And where did this go? A lot of it showed, and basically what we were doing was selling minerals worth 100 for 5. The miners were showing that excess basically as a profit, on which the center imposed income tax, and you can see that amount. There's also a bit of export duty there. And the remaining amount is the profit after tax, which is on top of the earned profit of 5,400 crores. An excess profit of 31,000 crores was made by the miners, which was basically property belonging to us. Now, let me give you a couple of comparisons to understand this 49,000 crore loss. In those 8 years, the entire revenues of the state of Goa was 27,000 crores. So you can see 27,000 crores was far below the loss that we had suffered. And 27,000 crores was also far below the amount that the mining companies captured unfairly. And you can understand the political implications of something like this. Now, I want to point out a couple of other things. This loss to the Goans is, first of all, a loss to every single Goan equally. So when you divided it across all the Goans, each and every Goan in the state of Goa over those 8 years lost 3.5 lakhs. Each and every person. So whether it is the poorest person or the richest person, everybody lost 3.5 lakhs. And a few people got very rich. This is clearly looting economics. This is not capitalism. Because the principle of capitalism is property rights. If we own the mineral, we should have the money when we sell the mineral. Now, how do we resolve this? How do we try and change this? And Goa Foundation and all of us really looked at what is the best practice around the world, and we've condensed it into 5 simple principles, which we believe are both practical, legal, economic, and follow many other kinds of systems. So let me take you through this proposal. First, the minerals of this minerals are owned by the state of Goa on behalf of the people and especially future generations. Second, since we have inherited the minerals, we must make sure future generations inherit either the minerals or their full value. Third, if we decide to sell our minerals, we must ensure zero loss. We must get the full value of the minerals. Fourth, we must save the entire value of the minerals for our future generations, and we are recommending a Norway-style fund, a future generations fund. And specifically, we are asking for this to be managed by the National Pension Scheme, because they have a very clean structure to make sure that the funds are invested in low-cost index tracking funds, which will earn the market rate of return, and it will be very difficult for any politician or asset manager in the private sector to get a higher return. And lastly, we own the mineral, we own the fund, we own the income from the fund. So distribute this income equally to all as a citizen's dividend, a right of ownership. So just quickly, the minerals belongs to everybody, especially future generations. We are effectively selling our minerals. We must get its full value, save the value for our children in a new income earning asset. And since we all own the income from that asset, distribute it equally to all as owners. How does this change things? We think there are 7 basic pathways. The first is government is essentially now sustainable. We are not taking 51,000 crores, losing 49,000 crores, getting 2,400 crores of royalty, calling that royalty income and consuming that, not even saving that. This will lead to a much higher savings rate, because all that money now is converted into financial assets, which will then go into the overall Indian economy and will enable growth. These are extremely long-term funds. The fund, as I explained, because it will be invested in an index tracking kind of a methodology, it would earn the market rate of return. And as we all understand, this is almost impossible for individual politicians or asset managers to meet. The citizens' dividend is nothing but a universal basic income. To give you a sense of scale, if the state of Goa had taken that 52,000 crores, saved it in a permanent fund, and earned just 3% real income and distributed that equally, today each person in the state of Goa would get 1,000 rupees of a dividend, each person 1,000 rupees of dividend every month. a family of 4 today would get 4,000 rupees a month. This would also create improved governance because there's less money which is going to politicians, less easy money going to politicians to spend. So they would have to improve the quality of either their investment and then go to the public and explain to them, we are delivering good services, please pay taxes. It would also stem the overall increase in inequality, and as now many people have understood, including the IMF, rising inequality tends to act as a drag on the economic performance. If there is broad spread prosperity, the economy grows faster. And lastly, this is an obviously kind of a fair kind of a system. Nobody likes it. Each stakeholder wants a little bit more. The politicians want more, the miner wants more, the mining employees want more, the mining dependent wants more. Even NGOs, we do want the government to take some money and use it for our favorite cause. But in totality, if any of this is done, what we're essentially doing is stealing from our children, taking their inheritance and saying, we want to spend it. And that is frankly an enormously immoral kind of act. And finally, the criticality of this is that what is happening is when we take minerals out, we are taking the royalty and calling it revenue. Politicians love revenue and voters also love revenue from minerals because their taxes go down, they get higher subsidies. But if this kind of thinking continues, every last bit of mineral in the world will be extracted and consumed and civilization will collapse. That is the problem. Here is the solution. Let me end here. Thank you.
Wonderful, Rahul. That was very, very interesting and very clear also. You have basically developed a model that takes the UBI a step forward and improves on the Alaska model substantially, the Alaska model for oil. You have developed a specific model which includes a market intervention in form of a fund and a perpetuity of income, which is great because the management and the ownership of division and distribution is no longer in the hands of a few, but is actually in an institutional structure, which is a index fund. So wonderful. Now we have a bunch of interesting questions for both of you. Rajesh, if you can switch on your video. I had a few questions for Rajesh first. Rajesh, two questions. One was, you said replace Chinese workers, replace 10 crore Chinese workers. You are talking about replacing these workers in Africa, India, or China itself?
Yatish, basically, this is the moment, what China did in the 80s is it replaced tens of probably a large percentage of large number of workers in the US and Europe as manufacturing moved from America and Western Europe to China. What I'm suggesting is that India's initial, right now, the lower costs which are there can actually replace 10 crore Chinese workers in China with Indian workers. In fact, Chinese companies need lower costs of operation. Okay? Not just the global supply chains, not just the global players. So this is India's moment. India can do to China what China did to the world, the Western world in the 80s and 90s.
I like that competitive spirit there. Rajesh, another question. You said that this is dependent on borrowing $2 trillion. Now, you have been an investor and you've raised funds. Borrowing, and particularly borrowing in this market, has multiple aspects to it. The underlying asset, the response of the global markets, when there is liquidity collapsing the world over. Do you think it is practical to suggest a global raising plan of $2 trillion, which is actually equivalent to the whole package that US just released, So tell us a little bit more about the $2 trillion raise, if you were to do it.
Yatish, there is about 15 to 17 trillion or some such large amount sitting and earning negative interest rates globally. That means investors are paying banks to hold that money. That's number one. Second is the world needs a place where they can be guaranteed even some positive returns in dollars. If India can do that, and India actually can do that because we are backing that up with $20 trillion worth of public assets of our own. All that we need to do is to commit to the asset monetization. If we can do that, I'm sure that there will be investors globally willing to invest into India because there are very few good places to invest where they can earn positive returns.
Okay, wonderful. So now I'm going to ask some, a lot of interesting questions have popped up in the last, when both of you were talking. I will take the first one, and this is a question that both of you can answer because both of you suggested a structure model which is in a sense linked to the trust or the probity that you expect from the government. And this question comes from Anirudh Datta. And he's asking basically that, considering the fact that, the government in both your plans, it is the government which is going to be responsible for doing it. And, we rarely trust the government or the politicians to accept or enable the structures that you are proposing, both the 10, 20, 30 plan and the 5-point plan that Rahul suggested. What do you think it will take to make this plan acceptable? Rajesh first and then Rahul, please.
In fact, I had a team which did a lot of work in this in 2018, and we had proposed the setting up of an independent Dhan Vapasi Commission, which had 4 parts to it: identification of the assets, restructuring of the assets, so cleaning up the titles, getting all that sorted out, auctioning, and then transfer of money to the people. We had encoded this into a full bill, which was actually sent to every Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha MP at that time. It's there on our website, along with a full report. So it can be done in a very transparent manner, absolutely possible.
Rahul, what do you think about the integrity and the trust deficit with the government on executing your proposal?
That is a really big issue, and our work has really started from that. At least my analysis started from that. Our structure is actually in some ways designed to deal with this. The first problem we've identified is most people don't know who owns the minerals. I've met, I know, I've seen chief ministers who thought like the national government owns the minerals, people in the CAG. Most people at the state level have some general idea the government owns us in trust. But constitutionally, nobody really understands the the nitty-gritty of it. In NITFP, for instance.
Yeah.
So Article 294, 295, 297 is the main part. Then you have the public trust doctrine. We talked about it, which is under Article 14, right to life, and the intergenerational equity principle, again, Article 14, right to life. So that's one part of it, that it's constitutional. And let me also just share my screen for a second to just show what we've achieved already, to show that there is pathway traction on it. Okay, let me just. So in the National Mineral Policy, last year we got these 2 statements. The first is natural resources, including minerals, are a shared inheritance, where the state is the trustee on behalf of the people to ensure future generations receive the benefit of the inheritance. Second is, state governments will endeavor to ensure that the full value of the mineral is received by the state. So this part of it is really zero loss, and there is no way we can avoid the state involvement in this aspect because the state is the legal owner, so the state has to sell it, unless we do some constitutional change to say somebody else is the owner. The fourth principle was the permanent fund, and the Goa Iron Ore Permanent Fund has actually been set up under Supreme Court judgment on grounds of intergenerational equity. There is 500 crores. Unfortunately, the state government still sees it as their money and they want to spend the money instead of save it for future generations. The citizens' dividend is the last bit which we are fighting for. But there are many examples of cooperators paying dividends. So we really don't think there is a technical or a legal problem. The real question is whether politicians will do something like this and how does this deal with the corruption. The politicians, I think a far-sighted politician like happened in Alaska could well take the stance that if I implement these 5 principles, I will be remembered in history, not just in Goa, in India, globally, forever. Because this is really an extremely far-sighted kind of an idea that whoever implements will go down in history. So it is possible that a politician will take it up. But if you look at the control issues in this, what we're effectively doing is making everybody a stakeholder in the minerals and explaining to them they have a duty to watch over this, because if there is a loss, it is a loss to them and their future generations are going to ask. Now, when everybody is interested, the zero loss goal should hopefully reduce that 95% loss to maybe single digits. And then the politician's role ends really after the extraction, because everything goes into the national pension scheme. Because the national pension scheme is very well designed, it has certain political protections by having all the state and central government employees having their savings in that. It also has a protection of competing out the asset managers on a daily basis, which makes political interference more difficult. We also believe that all of this and quite a bit more actually has to go into the constitution if this really has to work. This cannot be done just by laws. We have parts of it in the constitution, but we need further protections.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. So just there are more questions. I thought we'll give some time to some more questions also, Rahul. Thank you for that. It's great to see that the government is accepting and acknowledging and moving with what you're proposing. There's a question from Mansa, and I think both of you should wait on this particular questions because both of you come from a financial entrepreneur kind of a background. So Mansa's question is that should Milton Friedman's idea of negative income tax be explored at this point? Yeah.
Okay. On this, what we are proposing in Dhanvapasi is slightly different in the sense that it's about the public wealth, and that should be shared equally. There should be no discrimination. Every Indian citizen has a right to that wealth, and therefore the distribution of that should be done to every Indian family. I think the negative interest rate is a negative income tax rate, sorry, is an interesting idea from Friedman, but not directly applicable to the idea that I'm proposing.
Rahul?
Yeah, I mean, negative income tax is effectively, sort of looking at it as a government transfer or a toll. And I think the big difference in this, like with Rajesh, is this is for us a right of ownership. It's not even a question of discussing it. But having said that, should India look at the sort of negative income tax idea? And I don't think it's really practical, because if 2% of the population is filing income taxes of maybe 5%, your negative income tax assumes that there will be a tax return. And if nobody's filing taxes, because, frankly, lots of people don't even know about all of this, and it's not going to work at a practical level today.
Yeah. Now, there's one question from Deepshika, and I think, Rahul, you're best suited for answering this question. And our question is basically that, when do we stop monetizing? You've suggested a way of distributing and increasing the monetization. But when do we actually stop monetizing minerals, especially considering the ecology and the social impact of mining on even a state like Goa? So, is that something that you have applied yourself on, and what is your views on this?
Yeah, so the way we think about it is this: we've inherited the minerals. Why have we inherited the minerals? Because our ancestors have not extracted the minerals. There have been about 30,000 generations of humans before us. Each one has taken the decision to leave it in the ground. If we extract the minerals, we are denying the opportunity, in a sense, to the next maybe 1 million generations or further. So it is a very serious question. We need to really think about why it is that we are extracting our minerals, or why are we selling off our wealth? Fundamentally, the question is, if you inherit a piece of jewelry or a piece of land, what is pushing you to sell it off and try and get a higher yield?
Yeah.
And the related question is, can the fund be protected in perpetuity for future generations? The mineral is pretty easy. And I suspect a lot of people will argue that, given the kind of things we're seeing, can a fund really in climate change, will Norway's fund exist if climate change really hits us? And if Norway's fund does not exist, we have cheated our future generations by extracting.
There is another question which is coming from Ganesh Shankar Rai, and it is more in line with not exactly your presentation, but it is more in line with what people are feeling and observing in the ecosystem, which is that because of the pandemic, inequality will has been growing rapidly and will grow much more faster in the coming years, months. You think this? This is the concern. That will it lead to consolidation of wealth? And do you? I fundamentally don't think so. It would. It's anything. It will, because if the systems are robust enough to follow a procedure for it. But I would like both of you to weigh in on this issue. Rajesh, Rahul. Rajesh first. Yeah.
Okay. I think if you look at the inequality question, inequality has always been there and will always be there. I think the question to really ask, and we are all unequal in different aspects. Okay. If we want equality of wealth, then let's talk communism and socialism, and we've gone through that path and that doesn't work. The question to really ask is, the poor people in rich countries, okay, what is the kind of life that they have? And even that life today is many times better than what was there probably even 2 generations ago, in terms of what items they can afford and so on. I think the way we have to look at it is, in India, the differences which are there, the life of the poor people, and we are seeing that in the migrants played out in the migrant story right now. I think you need to ensure that there is a basic level for life. You need to, the fact that there is 50 lakh rupees worth of share of wealth that they have and they don't even know about it. Okay, they are not being given that back. We can actually double incomes in India at the lowest level. The median family in India, the average family, has an income of just over 1 lakh rupees a year. And when we are saying put 1 lakh rupees more and give them the freedom to decide how it is going to be used, that's going to start changing things. Once you're never going to solve the inequality problem, but you will solve the poverty problem. You'll start pushing India towards prosperity.
Rahul?
Yeah, I think if you look at the overall COVID crisis, and at least I've been tracking what's happening in the US, because the data seems to be better there, there's clearly a consolidation of wealth taking place. The rich there through this crisis have become like, maybe $1 trillion richer already. And this is partly the political system, in the sense that, all this fiscal stimulus and all of that is still being captured in an unequal manner. If the whole 2 trillion was distributed equally to everybody in the US, inequality would not rise, but it is being captured by larger entities, and inequality is rising. And exactly to Rajesh's point, at least with minerals, I find it really shocking that we have lost the opportunity to have 1,000 rupees a person a month. We could have eliminated extreme poverty in Goa, and if everybody got 1,000 rupees, enterprise would really, take off. What are we doing?
Yeah. So I'm sure that the pandemic will exacerbate the problem further as we go forward, because what was a tumble will now become an avalanche, especially for the most poor. And systems need to be built ground upwards, and for that. There was another question which I thought, Rajesh, because you have worked a little bit in this space and you have in the last few years also, when you talked about the giving, making Swatantra cities or making the cities more viable, it was a point in your slide. And, we are at a stage in our, you may say, we are in the stage in the pandemic that there is a control and command structure which is emerging from the federal government. Most states are, as you know, fund deficit. Their budgets are short. Their revenues are almost negligible. The only revenue was excise revenue, which they've tried to recover by opening up the liquor vents. But the states are in a more precarious situation than the center. And there is a tussle between the two in terms of redistribution of funds. And in this environment, you also have the 15th Finance Commission, which has tabled a report and said that, we need to devolve certain powers and financial powers at that to the cities. And this devolution of powers should be followed by direct flow of funds from the central pool to the city. But this idea, which was tabled, just before, and it was in discussion in the pre-COVID era, will, as usual, be maybe hijacked by the states' need to consolidate and control power more so. So, but there, what is your view? Is there a chance to kind of push this agenda strongly and powerfully, and if so, with whom and how?
I think until the cities are run by a municipal commissioner or a mayor who's under the thumb of the state chief minister, we are not going to see real reform or wealth creation happen in cities. Because for the chief minister, the cities basically become collection centers of money because the votes are all in the rural areas. And that is why the cities need to be made independent of the state and the center. Vijay Kelkar has given an excellent suggestion where a certain percentage of GST collections itself should be directly devolved straight to the cities. It has to start with freeing the cities. Once the monies come in, once the funds flow start, you'll have the functionaries come in, and the functions will start happening a lot better in the cities. So until the cities are made independent, okay, and that is where wealth gets created. All of us really want to be in cities. No one wants to be in rural areas. Our parents moved from rural areas to cities. This is a one-way traffic, and that's why cities need independence.
No, I understand the rationale, Rajesh. Now I'm just a follow-up question to that, because this is an important one, both in terms of control, command, and actual democracy and freedom on the ground, which is the city. And unless until you free that economic engine, financially, from a decision-making point of view, and empowerment of the democratic structure which exists in the form of municipal councillors, who actually don't have any financial powers. Most places, most cities have done the elections. They followed the amendment of the 73rd, 72nd amendment, but they've not implemented. They've not transferred the financial powers from the municipal commissioner to the municipal council. So that gap, and so the municipal commissioner is a bureaucrat who reports into the chief minister's office, not to the chief secretary, but because he's a municipal commissioner who's controlling a large city like a Bombay or a Delhi or a Amritsar or a Ludhiana or Jalandhar. The chief minister is wary of devolving those powers. Now, this issue, has been talked about. The rationale has been explained. The 15th Finance Commission actually accepted Kelkar's recommendation and said that this much value should be transferred. But even after the fund is transferred, the management of that fund, if it is with the municipal commissioner and not with the municipal council, the democratic elected mayor or the democratic elected council does not have any play or say in the usage of that fund. So that is the so-called nub of this issue. And what is it that the civil society, and this is an important one, can do to make it happen? The last question,
Yeah.
closing comments from both of you on this.
Okay, I'll give a quick answer. I think what cities need are directly elected and empowered mayors. We have done a lot of work on their municipal commission rules have to be redrafted. And only when that happens, only when the people in the cities realize that they are being shortchanged, okay, and they come together, will this real change happen.
Rahul?
Well, I'm not going to respond to the cities bit because it's a little bit out of what I'm doing. But I do want to just plead with the audience, take a look at this issue of intergenerational equity. It's critical to civilization survival. There is something that can be done, but it will happen eventually if everybody stands up. We have something going on in Goa, but every state needs to have people demanding this from their politicians, and we need a national movement also. But if this happens, I think we could transform the country. So,
Okay.
that's hope.
Great, great, thanks. So, difficult to summarize both your research and both your thing, but I will try. The 3 points, very powerful points from you, Rajesh. 10, 20, 30, 1, 2, 3. Is very easy to explain, and I think a beginning could be made immediately on that front, by especially on the land side, and specifically because even the Prime Minister has said that land labor laws is one of the areas, one of the 4 areas, 3 areas among the 4 that needs to see next round of reforms. And identification of that land, as you suggest in the Dhan Wapsi, setting up a small body which can do the geotagging of the land, where it exists, who controls it, who owns it, and how it can be released should be the first step. A land, basically a land identification and geotagging body, which could then go to minerals and other areas. Rahul, like and love what you are doing on the ground, and love the model that you have built in terms of connecting mineral rights, intergenerational equity, converting into a market mutual fund, pension fund kind of a model, applying both the market modeling into a distribution thing. Thank you very much, both of you, for spending your time and explaining your ideas to us. Thank you to the audience for their bunch of interesting questions.